Hi everyone, this is Christopher Paolini again, and I'm here today talking with none other than Garth Nix. Thanks for being here, Garth.
It's a pleasure, Christopher. Thank you.
You're actually talking to me from, is it Sydney?
Sydney, yes, Sydney, Australia, the other side of the world.
Now, for those of you who don't know, you've written a whole bunch of different series. I've read Sabriel, Lyriel, and Abhorsen, if I'm saying those correctly.
Absolutely, yep.
And I know you had another book in that series come out last year. Was it Clariel?
Clariel came out last year. That's right. It's a prequel to the others. Yes. I've also written standalone novels. I have a standalone Regency romance with fantasy, with magic, called Newt's Emerald, which comes out comes out in October, so very soon.
So what does your writing process actually look like?
I'm sure, like you, notebooks full of things that could be novels. There are so many, and you have to prioritize because you can't possibly write them all. And I think that is one of the attractions of short fiction, is because some of those ideas get to be used. Because I can write a short story in a couple of weeks if it all goes well. Sometimes those weeks are spread across 6 months because I don't do them all in one go. But then I get to use that idea. I get to try out some of those ideas which have been kicking around and want to come out, and I can do that in a sort of a time-effective way. Whereas you really have to make those decisions. Can I write this novel or that novel? It's going to take me 9 months, a year, maybe longer. So it really does have to. You've got to weigh up all the pros and cons of that raw material, I suppose. And also, you never really know where it's going to go. You've only got the beginning, which, of course, if you're like me, you always love. You love the beginning, and who knows where it will go.
I find, and this is different for every author, of course, but like you're saying about the beginning, is you get the idea for a story, and it's not necessarily the whole story. Sometimes it's just the inception of the story, and that's what draws you into writing the whole thing. And then you have to construct the framework to support that inception, that key moment that begins everything. And I've had the experience where sometimes I'm a couple hundred pages in, and then I'm looking back going, wait a minute, how did I end up where I am now when all I wanted to do was write about that first few moments?
Yeah. Well, I think, and as you say, every writer is different, and it's always important to remember that because everyone works in different ways. But I think that's a pretty common perception, and certainly for me, uh, I know the beginning. I know a few key things, but I don't know. I don't know all of it. I don't know what's going to happen. I usually know where I want to get to in the end, but again, I don't have specifics. I have a sort of I know the feeling that I want at the end without actually knowing how I'll get there. I have at other times said, no, I like writing outlines, but then I don't follow them. So I will write. I'll write an outline. Normally, after I've actually written a little bit of the book, I'll write the first chapter or the prologue or a piece of prose, just to get the feel of the book, and then I'll write an outline for what is going to happen. Except, of course, it doesn't happen. As I've said, before, it's kind of like a Zen outline. You have to write it, but then you don't use it. But the exercise of writing it is helpful. It just feeds your subconscious, I think.
And why do you think that you do sort of move away from the outline as you're writing?
I think the story just becomes alive, becomes more alive as I'm writing it. And I think the outline is kind of like a really old, terrible map when you're out driving somewhere. And it's got some of the key stuff will be the same, but a lot of the detail in between will be utterly different. But it's still quite handy because when you get completely lost, you can get out the map, you can get out your outline and go, well, chapter 2 to 12 are nothing like in the outline. I didn't go there, but I still want to go to where I wanted to be in chapter 13 in the outline. So now I've got to figure out how to get there from where I am now.
So do you? I mean, personally, yes, I do. I do outline, but then, as with you, I find that I often move away from the outline as I'm get further and further into the story and know the characters better and all of that. But I do tend to work out the world or the universe of the story in fairly explicit detail in certain places. I mean, there's broad strokes, but there's some basic fundamentals I feel like I have to know in order to tell the story. So how about you?
I actually don't typically. I discover the world through the story as I go along. I guess I'm constantly pausing and thinking, well, how does this work? What do I need here? I like that sense of discovery. I like discovering with the character as I go along, and in the same way that a reader does, I suppose.
Have you ever found that that ends up leading to, let's say, with the, like, especially like with the magic, that you end up having problems with being contradicting yourself if you're sort of working
Yeah,
it out as you're going along?
yeah. Certainly, I do. I do on occasion have difficulties where I think, well, this doesn't make sense in terms of what I've established in this world, but then it can't happen. So the story has to do something else. So in a way, it's quite a good restriction. I mean, as a fantasy writer, you draw the bounds you're going to work within, and you have to work within them. You have to work within those bounds, or the story will suck. You'll. I mean, that's basically how it works. Once you break that suspension of disbelief, there's nowhere to go. So I always try and make the stories feel as real as they can. And part of that is the consistency of the world, the consistency of the magic, of everything about it. It has to feel real. If a reader is reading it and there's a change in how things work, which is convenient for the story, then that's it. They're gone, and
Yeah.
I'm gone as a reader when I encounter that.
I mean, that's always been the problem I had with the more fairy tale style systems of magic, where things essentially happen because they need to happen and not because there's any underlying mechanical reason for that, which can work very, very well, I think, at the hands of certain authors, but it takes great skill to make that work because there's the tendency to just have no underlying structure, and then there's no. For example, I loved the Darkest Rising series and parts of it. I love the mood that she was able to conjure. But at the same time, I had that same problem where the magic was so emotion based almost that it was very hard for me to understand why something happened. Obviously, it happened because the story needed to happen, it needed it to happen, but there was no actual reason for why the characters were able to do what they were able to do. And that always bothered me as a reader when I was a kid.
That's interesting because I love those books, particularly The Darkest Rising, the second one. Um, I think as long as you have a mystical underpinning to everything, it will work regardless of whether there's a mechanical underpinning, if that makes sense. Though it won't always work for every reader. I think the more fantasy resonates with deeply held myth and legend and fairy tales and things that we've grown up with as a deeply programmed part of our culture, the better they work. So if you don't need to necessarily you don't need to explain the magic, and in fact, in most cases, I think you should not explain the magic too much, but it has to feel as if it makes sense. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
there's an emotional and mystical reality to it, even if it doesn't bear up to a close analysis. But consistency is a part of that.
So how do you feel working? Because I've never really collaborated with anyone other than my sister, who's also a writer. We've worked on a few things together, but I've never worked with anyone else. So how was it for you working with Shaun Williams and collaborating? And I mean, what were the mechanics of that, the logistics of that?
I think probably the very first thing is you have to have a very clear view going in how it's going to work. You do need to set it all down, make sure you have a writer's agreement. Even we're old friends, we're very good friends, but you never know what's going to happen. You never know what will occur. So it's very important to make sure you have a legal agreement about who does what, who owns what, and so on. So I think if you're contemplating co-writing, that is a very important part of the process, is making sure that's covered, because then it's clear, it's all set down on paper in a signed agreement. And then we had probably the most fun part, which was where we got together in person and just talked about the story and just worked it out. And sitting around drinking Guinness and saying, well, why don't we do this, or we're going to have that, and we actually did a little bit of world building. We worked out the setting. I drew a map of the town. I like drawing maps, so that was my job. And we did an outline after we'd worked out the outline in quite a lot of detail. So quite a lot of detail in that chapter outline. I then wrote the first chapter, which was really setting the scene and the tone. And then Shaun went away and he wrote the whole rest of the first draft, because he writes very, very quickly. He's a very fast writer. And then he sent it back to me. And we talked during that process, because, of course, there were points where it was like, well, the outline says this, but no, can we do this instead? And we would talk it through. So there was a bit of to and fro during that process. But he basically wrote the rest of the draft very quickly. Came back to me. I rewrote it. I think in the first book, I took out about 15,000 words, and I put in about 20,000 words. And this isn't a 65,000 word book. So, there's quite a bit coming and going. I kicked it back to Shaun. He then rewrote it again. And it went backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times. And the end result was, we can't actually tell who wrote what. But I know many co-writers who work very differently. I was just talking to Scott Westerfeld, Margot Lanigan, and Deborah Biancotti, who have a new book called Zeros out, which the 3 of them wrote together. And that has 6 characters. That is a cast of 6 characters. And they took 2 characters each. And there's basically each chapter focuses on one character. So they wrote the chapters with their characters. But then Scott was a sort of overall editor, putting it all together, as well as writing his own too. So there's many, many different ways to do these things. I know some other co-authors I know where one will write all the male characters, one will write all the female characters, and so on. I mean, there's lots and lots of different ways of approaching these kinds of co-writing things.
Do you have any advice for any of your young readers who might be interested in trying their hand at a book themselves?
I offer very much the traditional advice, which is, I think Robert Heinlein offered this advice, and this is basically a riff on that, which is read a lot, write a lot, revise a lot, and submit a lot. But if you want to write good fantasy, you need to read more than just fantasy. You need to read more to find an original voice and so on. So read history, read contemporary fiction, read everything. Even probably the backs of cornflakes packets are better than it all. You just never know what will be useful. And I think having that sort of magpie approach is really important. The more varied stuff you put in your head, the more likely you'll be able to create your own unique mix. But also watch films, watch plays, listen to great music, be inspired by other people's creativity, because that will help fuel you up to create your own art. It's quite inexplicable where things come from, except that the more you put into your head, the more likely something will come out. So the more you read, the more you think about things, the more likely that ideas will come. And of course, a book isn't one idea; it's thousands or tens of thousands of ideas, joined together, used, discarded, molded. It's never just one thing. It's many, many different ideas. Writing is both an art and a craft. The art side is that more amorphous creativity. Who knows where it comes from? But the craft side is actually doing something with that raw material. It's making something. And the more you do, the better you'll get. The more you practice. And it's a lifelong work. You learn new things, learn new techniques. Hopefully hopefully work out your own bad habits and get rid of them. The sooner you start practicing, the more likely that you'll get good enough to create something that other people want to read. So it's never too early to start. It's never too late to start. And maybe the first novel will just be for practice. Maybe it won't. You just never know. When you write something, you create possibilities. If you stop halfway, nothing can happen. If you've got half a novel, that's nothing. But if you finish it, you've created a possibility.
And even if it's bad in the first draft, at least you have something you can start to fix then. You can't fix something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't revise a blank page. That's absolutely true. And I think it's very important. Somebody, and I don't know who said it, said the only difference between amateur and professional writers is that professionals finish things. As you say, even if it's terrible, you can fix it up. And the other thing I would say about that is that everyone thinks their work is terrible, typically, partway through. I mean, I hate my books halfway through, as a rule. I loathe them.
I nearly stopped the one I'm working on now. I got halfway through and just...
I mean, you get that thing where you doubt the book, you doubt yourself. Even when you've written books before, you think, I've somehow forgotten how to do it. I can't write anymore. I'm no good. But if you press on, quite often you decide that it's not as bad as you thought, or you can fix it up, or both, actually.
Well, I think that's some great advice from start to finish, and that's very much matches with my own experience of this whole unusual career. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
This was a pleasure. We definitely have to do this again sometime.
Absolutely, and hopefully our paths will cross somewhere down the track. I'm sure they will.